The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel louder than it should. Somewhere in America, sometime in the 1970s, a woman got into a car with a stranger. Not exactly a new concept. Maybe she thought it was just another trip. Maybe she needed money. Maybe she just trusted the wrong person for a few minutes. No gunshots, no screams anyone could hear, no witnesses. Just a pair of hands around her throat, and then silence. At first, it looked like an isolated tragedy. A woman lost somewhere on the margins of society. But then it happened again and again. For decades, women disappeared like this across the United States. Florida, Texas, California, Mississippi, Arkansas. Women who lived on the edge of society. Women whose disappearances were often dismissed, misclassified, or barely investigated at all. Women whose names many people never even learned. The cases were scattered across different cities, different decades, and different police departments that never realized they were all chasing the same man. Because the man responsible kept moving. City to city, state to state, decade to decade. And for years, no one saw the pattern. Not because the clues weren't there, but because the victims were the kind of people society often forgets. By the time the investigators finally stopped him, he had been killing for more than 30 years. And when he finally began to talk, he didn't confess to a handful of murders. He confessed to 93, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, the podcast where we examine the lives, behaviors, and psychology behind the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when the truth finally catches up. You've been asking me to cover this case since 2020. So tonight, we're finally diving in. This is the story of Samuel Little, the man who strangled dozens of women across America while their cases slipped quietly into forgotten police files. Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia. His early life was marked by instability and hardship that could follow him well into adulthood. Little's mother, who was believed to have been involved in sex work, was frequently absent during his childhood. Because of this, he was raised primarily by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. While his grandmother provided a home for him, Little's upbringing was far from stable, and many who later studied his life pointed to these early years as the beginning of a long pattern of behavioral problems. As a child, Little reportedly struggled in school. He had difficulty fitting in socially. Teachers and classmates described him as disruptive, prone to getting in trouble. Some reports suggest that he experienced bullying and isolation, which may have contributed to his growing anger and resentment toward other people. During his youth, Little also claimed to have suffered a serious head injury, something investigators and psychologists later took note of while examining his behavior. The details of the incident, however, remain uncertain. According to Little's own account, he was struck in the head by another student during a fight at school and was knocked unconscious. He later told doctors and investigators that he remained unconscious for several hours and that the incident occurred when he was still in elementary school. While the story may sound dramatic, injuries like this are not unheard of. In fact, cases of children suffering severe or even fatal head trauma from school fights have occurred recently. So the scenario itself is not impossible. However, it's important to be transparent about the source of this claim. There are no publicly confirmed medical records that document this injury. The only information about it comes from statements Little made during interviews after his arrest, particularly in conversations with Texas Ranger James Holland. While it is impossible to say exactly how much this injury influenced his later actions, head trauma has often been associated with impulse control problems and aggressive behavior. By the time Little reached his teenage years, he had already begun developing a pattern of criminal activity. His first arrest came as a teenager, primarily for theft, petty crimes. What began as minor offenses quickly escalated into more serious acts of violence. Records show that he frequently got into fights and displayed increasingly aggressive behavior toward others. These early run-ins with the law set the stage for a lifetime spent cycling in and out of the criminal justice system. Little's adult life became defined by constant movement and a repeated arrest across multiple states. Throughout the 60s and 70s, he was arrested numerous times for crimes including theft, fraud, assault, and driving under the influence. One of his earliest known violent crimes occurred in 1975. He was arrested for beating and strangling a woman in Florida. Although the victim survived and Little served time for the attack, the incident foreshadowed the method he would later use in the majority of his murders. Over the course of his life, Samuel Little spent decades behind bars for a variety of offenses. Investigators estimate that he spent roughly half of his adult life in prison or jail. However, because many of his sentences were for relatively short periods of time, he was repeatedly released back into society. Each release allowed him to travel to new cities and states, making it extremely difficult for law enforcement to connect crimes that occurred hundreds or even thousands of miles apart. This constant cycle of arrest, incarceration, and release created a situation where Little was frequently on the radar of police but rarely held long enough to stop his escalating violence. His criminal history was extensive, but because his offenses were so scattered, no single department ever really got a complete picture of the threat he possessed. By the time investigators would finally uncover the full scope of his crimes, decades later, it became clear that the troubled boy from Reynolds, Georgia, had grown into one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. That early life, marked by instability, violence, and repeated contact with the criminal justice system, had been the beginning of a trajectory that would ultimately leave dozens of victims across the United States. By the early 1970s, investigators believed that Samuel Little had already begun the pattern of violence that would eventually make him have the most confirmed kills in American history. While many of the exact dates are difficult to determine, law enforcement now believe his earliest murders likely began during this period, the early 1970s. At the time, however, no one realized that a serial predator was operating. Little's victims were almost always women who did not really exist in regular society. They were sex workers, women struggling with addiction, people experiencing poverty and unstable housing. These were people whose lives were already complicated and they were often invisible to the systems meant to protect them. When they disappeared, they were often few people even advocating for them. In some cases, missing persons reports were delayed or never filed at all. This vulnerability made them easier targets for someone like Little, who frequently encountered these women in areas where they were seeking rides, money, or some kind of assistance. His method of killing also helped him evade detection for decades. Little typically murdered his victims through strangulation. His hands were his weapon. Because strangulation requires no gun, no knife, and leaves behind far less trace evidence, there was no ballistics to trace, no murder women for investigators to recover. In some cases, particularly when a victim had a history of substance abuse or when the body was discovered long after its death, the cause of death was even misinterpreted. They didn't even know that the person had been strangled. After killing his victims, Little often disposed of their bodies in very remote areas, empty fields, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, along highways. Sometimes these bodies weren't discovered for months or even years. In other cases, the remains were found, but the victim was never even reported missing. We never got a chance to identify them. And without that identification, investigators had virtually nothing to work with. It became extremely difficult to determine where the victim had last been seen, who she had been seen with, or what circumstances even led to her death in the first place. Another major factor that allowed Little to operate undetected was his own transient lifestyle. He wasn't just killing other transient people, he lived that too. He moved constantly, traveling from different state to different state all throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This was Florida, Texas, California, Mississippi, Arkansas. Sometimes the crimes would be committed thousands of miles apart. And during that time period, police departments didn't have the centralized databases or communication systems that we have today. Crimes committed in different jurisdictions were often never compared, and information sharing between departments was almost non existent and definitely inconsistent. Investigators also faced challenges because some victims were initially believed to have died from other causes. When a body was discovered and the victim had a clear history of drug use or unstable living conditions, that death could be assumed to be an overdose, assumed to be an accident. A lot of the original victims were deemed to have died from exposure instead of homicide. Essentially, the cops went, well, this person got high and fell asleep somewhere they weren't supposed to and died because it was too cold outside or died because it was too hot outside. These assumptions sometimes delayed investigations or just limited the amount of resources that were devoted to the case. Jurisdictional barriers are still a problem in the United States, honestly. Even though we do have these national databases now, every police department is ultimately responsible for investigating the crimes within their own city or county. And without any clear evidence that links the cases together, detectives don't really have a reason to suspect that a similar death in a different state would be connected to one happening in their jurisdiction. Unless there is clear DNA evidence through the CODIS system, or the crime is so sensational and out there that it's just, oh, that weird case happened in California and we're over here in Florida. Unless it's something like that, they really have no reason to think that they need to overstep their boundaries. And most of them don't really want to. I mean, a lot of police departments across the country right now are underfunded and understaffed. It's not really this awesome, high profile job that people love for you to be a cop. Combining all these factors and adding in that the marginalization of the victims, and honestly, there wasn't really a lot of advocacy networks back then either. These cases just never received much of a sustained investigation. All this together created the perfect conditions for someone like Samuel Little to operate completely undetected. Vulnerable victims, no evidence left behind, and the crimes so scattered using our own disjointed justice system against us. And as a result, all these murders remained isolated incidents for decades, almost 40 years, completely invisible. Case files sat on shelves, victims went unidentified, and the connections between them remained hidden. Well, until 2012, when what first appeared to be a routine arrest at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, would expose the true scale of Samuel Little's crimes. Now, I have to give you some backstory here because now the CODIS system is called the Combined DNA Index System, and it was created in 1990 as a pilot software project by the FBI to connect 14 state and local laboratories. It was formally established on a national level, they called the NDIS, following the DNA Identification Act of 1994, and then the national database became operational in October of 1998, linking all 50 states. And so that's why we didn't have the information to catch someone like Samuel Little until he got caught for the first time in decades, September 5th, 2015. He got arrested at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky on narcotics charges. At first, the arrest seemed relatively minor compared to the long list of other offenses on his record. But when they took him into custody, they ran his information through the National CODIS database, and they discovered something that would completely shift the investigation. His DNA matched evidence that was collected from three unsolved murders in Los Angeles. Those murders had taken place decades earlier and involved women who had been strangled. The DNA evidence allowed investigators to link Little directly to the crimes, something that had never been possible when it originally occurred. And in 2014, he was extradited to California to stand trial, and by 2018, he was convicted of three murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even after securing the conviction, though, investigators suspected that this case was far from over because the detectives that were reviewing Little's criminal history and travel patterns started to notice something scary. For decades, every time he moved from one state to another, there were numerous unsolved murders involving strangulating women in places specifically that Little lived or had traveled through. Some investigators suspected they were looking at a serial killer whose crimes had never been fully uncovered. That suspicion eventually piqued the interest of Texas Ranger James Holland. And James Holland began interviewing Little while he was serving his life sentence. Holland was working these cold cases in Texas, and he believed that Little was responsible for several of the unsolved murders that he was looking into. So in 2018, he traveled to California to speak with him, hoping that he could just get some information about that case. At first, the conversation was slow, very cautious, but over time, Little began to trust him and began to talk. And what followed would become one of the most significant confession series in modern criminal investigations. During multiple interviews, Little would describe murders that had occurred across the country over several decades. He provided details about the victims, locations, circumstances, recalling events from the 70s and 80s with unbelievable clarity. During one interview, Holland asked him how he chose his victims, and Little reportedly said, "I don't pick them, I let them pick me." He claimed that many of the women approached him first, asking for a ride or for some assistance. In his mind, that meant that they had chosen to have this encounter with him. Investigators later noted that this framing was a way for Little to psychologically distance himself from responsibility. Even though he knew he was the one who ultimately attacked and killed these women, he had to give himself some kind of rationale. In another moment that disturbed investigators, Little was asked why he chose strangulation rather than a weapon. And according to interview notes, he simply raised his hands and said, "You don't need a gun. All you need is these." Holland later recalled that Little often spoke about the murders with little emotion, sometimes even smiling as he described events that took place decades before. Investigators also noticed something unusual about the way Little's memory worked. He struggled to remember basic timeline details, such as exact year, city, or even what name he had been using while he was driving through that area. But when he was asked about the women themselves, his recollection was remarkably precise. He could describe the victim's appearance in vivid detail: her hair color, height, clothing, the smallest physical feature, like a freckle, scar, or a gap in her tooth. In some cases, he even remembered the way she laughed or the final words she spoke before he attacked her. Holland later said that Little seemed to remember the crimes visually, almost as if he were replaying these scenes from a movie in his mind. That ability led investigators to ask him to draw the women he remembered, and Little began sketching portraits of victims from memory, recalling their faces from the crimes that he committed 30 some years before. The drawings were detailed enough that the FBI eventually released them to the public in hopes that someone would recognize these women who had remained unidentified now for decades. Perhaps the most disturbing detail Little shared during these interviews was what stayed with him the longest. He said the moment he remembered most clearly was not the act of killing those women, but the moment just before it happened. The moment when his victim realized she was in mortal danger. Eventually, Little confessed to killing 93 women. The number stunned investigators. If this was accurate, it would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history. As detectives began reviewing the information, many of the descriptions matched unsolved cases, some that were still open. Some details he recalled were so specific that investigators were able to connect them directly to existing case files. The portraits he drew also proved significant. In several cases, families and friends recognized the women in the sketches and contacted authorities, helping investigators finally identify missing persons victims who had been unknown for decades. By the time the interviews concluded, investigators had started the long process of verifying Little's claims and matching them to unsolved murders across the country. Dozens of cases have already been confirmed, and investigators believe more may eventually be linked to him. What began as a simple drug arrest in Kentucky revealed a criminal career that had remained hidden. Now, one of the most important parts of this story isn't the man who committed these crimes. It's the women whose lives were taken and whose names were ignored and forgotten. For many years, the victims connected to Samuel Little were treated as anonymous statistics. Many were sex workers, women struggling with addiction, people living on that side of society we don't like to think about. And when they disappeared, their cases were often not investigated with the same urgency given other victims. Some were listed as identified Jane Does. Others were simply filed away as missing people who were never found. But as investigators worked slowly through Little's confessions and the portraits he drew from memory, something began to change. Slowly, these women started to get their names back. So for a moment, we're going to stop talking about the killer and say their names. Melinda Lepre, Guadalupe Apodaca, Carol Linda Alford, Gwendolyn Moore, Audrey Nelson Everett, Evelyn Weston, Yvonne Hill, Daisy McGuire, Zena Marie Jones, Annie Lee Stewart, Rose Evans, Margaret Peggy Phelps, Denise Brothers, Linda Jackson, Joanne Gay, Nancy Carol Stevens, Mary Jo Payton, Barbara Barrow, Rosetta Bishop, Deborah Jackson, who for nearly 40 years had been known only as Orange Socks. And most recently, Yvonne Pless was identified in 2023 after decades being known as Macon Jane Doe. Unfortunately, investigators believe there are still many victims connected to Little who remain unidentified. The FBI has linked him to multiple Jane Doe cases across the United States, but because many of these women were never even reported missing in the first place, and records from the 1970s and 80s are incomplete, their identities may never be known. Each of these names represent a person who had a life became Each of these names represents a person who had a life before they became part of a police file. They had families, friends, childhood memories, and futures that were stolen from them. For decades, many of these women were dismissed or overlooked because of their circumstances. But the work of investigators, forensic scientists, and families who never stopped searching has helped restore some of their identities. And there are still many more victims whose names we may never actually know. But telling their stories and saying their names ensures that they are no longer invisible. Because while Samuel Little may be remembered for the number of murders he committed, the real story is about the women whose lives mattered, even when the world failed to notice them. One of the most difficult truths revealed by the crimes of Samuel Little is not just how long he was able to kill, but why it took so long for anyone to realize what was happening. His case exposed something deeply uncomfortable about the way this society, and sometimes the criminal justice system, values certain victims more than it values others. Many of Little's victims were transient women. Some were sex workers, addicts, homeless, living in unstable situations, women of color. And these circumstances made them especially vulnerable, not only to violence, but being overlooked after their disappearances. In the United States, there are long documented disparities in how homicide victims are investigated and reported depending on race, economic status, and social circumstances. Studies have shown that cases involving white victims, particularly white women, tend to receive more media attention, and in many cases, more investigative resources. Meanwhile, cases involving Black victims, Indigenous victims, and people living in poverty also receive far less coverage and urgency. This imbalance has sometimes been referred to by journalists and researchers as the missing white woman syndrome, highlighting how media and public attention are not always distributed equally. Even in my own journey as a true crime researcher and commentator, I have seen this imbalance play out in real life. My first national case fell under what people would recognize as missing white woman syndrome. I was brought in to participate in a 2020 documentary about the disappearance and murder of Gabby Petito. And while she absolutely deserved to be found and her killer exposed, the urgency around her disappearance had a distinctive fervor because she was young, beautiful, and yes, white. Meanwhile, so many missing women and girls appear on my news tracker every single day, and they receive one article if they're lucky, maybe one Amber Alert, and then I never hear about them ever again. I look up their names, and it just never tells me whether this person was found. Their stories disappear from the news cycle almost as quickly as they appear, and honestly, it just feels unfair. In cases like Samuel Little's, these disparities create the perfect environment for someone who operates without drawing widespread alarm. Many of his victims were people whose lives were already complicated, so complicated by poverty, addiction, and unstable housing. When individuals in these situations disappear, their absences are often just explained away. Well, they assume she just moved. She left town. Maybe she became even more of an addict than she already was. This delays missing persons reports. It slows down investigations before they can ever begin. Within the criminal justice system, these assumptions can sometimes influence how cases are initially approached. When the victim is perceived as being involved in risky behavior, like sex work, there's an unspoken tendency to treat that death as less urgent and less solvable. In some cases, the death might be misclassified entirely if you're an addict. A lot of things that don't seem to make much sense get classified as an overdose or an accident or exposure, even though if you just spent a little bit more time investigating this crime scene, it would be very obvious that this person did not die from an overdose. This lack of urgency does not necessarily come from malice on the part of investigators. Often it reflects systemic limitations, heavy caseloads, the assumptions that exist within society as a whole. But the impact is still so real. When victims are seen as problematic or disposable, and fewer resources are devoted to finding the answers, that means that people get away with murder. And for the families of these victims, the lack of empathy is devastating. Many people spend years trying to convince authorities that their loved ones matter and their disappearances deserve some kind of attention. In some of these cases, they waited decades before receiving confirmation of what they had assumed already happened. The investigation into Samuel Little ultimately forced many agencies to re examine cases long forgotten. It highlighted how easily violence remains hidden when it targets people whose lives are already marginalized. The lesson from this case is not about one man's crime, but also the need for equal urgency, equal compassion, and equal investigation for every victim, regardless of their race, income, or their circumstance. Samuel Little died December 30th, 2020, at the age of 80 years old while serving multiple life sentences in California State Prison. At the time of his death, he was being held at California State Prison, Los Angeles County, where he had been transferred after his conviction for those 3 murders in Los Angeles. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Little died of natural causes after several years of declining health. By the time he died, Samuel Little had already confessed to killing 93 women across the U.S., those murders spanning from the early 1970s into the mid 2000s. Investigators from the FBI and multiple law enforcement agencies have spent years working to verify these claims. Through a combination of DNA evidence, case records, and details only the killer could know, authorities have been able to confirm many of the murders he described. As of the most recent updates from the FBI, investigators have confirmed at least 60 of Little's victims. That number alone makes him the most prolific. However, his own statement suggests that number is higher. If Little's confessions are accurate, there are still 33 women whose deaths remain unconfirmed and whose identities have not been discovered. In the years leading up to his death, he continued to cooperate with investigators. After those initial interviews with the Texas Ranger in 2018, law enforcement officials from all across the country started flying to California to speak with him about their own unsolved murders that matched his known patterns. And these interviews did result in additional confessions and new leads in cold cases that were dormant for decades. Even as even as his health declined, investigators continued reviewing the statements, comparing them with old case files, missing persons reports, forensic evidence. In some cases, the details he provided reopened investigations. However, Little ultimately died before every confession could be fully investigated, and today dozens of his alleged victims remain unidentified. Several cases he described have yet to be matched to a specific missing person or any recovered remains. The work of identifying those victims is ongoing. Law enforcement agencies, forensic genealogists, and families of missing people continue to review the evidence Little left behind, including his confessions and the portraits he drew from memory. Even after his death, the investigation into Samuel Little's crimes continue as authorities work to uncover the names and stories of the women who have yet to be found. The most disturbing part of this story is not just what Samuel Little did. It's how long he was able to do it. Almost 40 years. Women disappeared across the U.S. No one realized the pattern. The victims were poor. They were struggling with addiction. They were sex workers. They were women of color. They were exactly the kind of people society tries to forget. Former FBI profiler Robert Ressler once said, "Serial killers hunt where the vulnerable live. If no one notices the victims are missing, the killer can keep hunting." Samuel Little used that. And the uncomfortable truth is that the conditions that allowed him to kill for 40 years did not disappear when he died. Every year in the United States, thousands of people are reported missing. Some are found, many are not. And when the victims are poor, homeless, addicted, living on the street, those cases still receive little attention. Their stories still disappear from the headlines and their names fade from public memory. Which means somewhere in America tonight, another missing person report is being filed. Another case file is being opened. And there's always the possibility that another pattern is forming, one that no one has noticed yet. Because predators don't just rely on violence. They rely on silence. They rely on indifference. They rely on the assumption that some people matter less than others. But eventually the truth catches up. And when it does, it always leaves something behind. A name, a case file, a trail. And if someone is willing to follow it long enough, the truth always leaves a trail. For the women whose names were lost for decades, that trail finally led back to them. My name is Brittany Ransom, and this has been When Killers Get Caught. See you next week.